Welcome, Professor. Thanks for joining us. Can you hear us?
Good morning, thank you.
Allora, il professor Solomon, diceva, una grande autorità, ha scritto un libro che è il libro più adottato nei master che si occupano di comunicazione e di, in particolare, comportamento dei consumatori. Si chiama Consumer Behavior, Buying, Having and Being. Non solo, ma i suoi studi vanno dalla psicologia del consumatore fino al mondo della moda, in particolare, che ci interessa molto da vicino. Allora, professore, innanzitutto io le vorrei chiedere, let's switch to English. Let me ask you first, Professor, you've been talking recently about shifting changes in consumer behavior. But at the end of the day, what do you think is the main change that we can describe, and what's the impact can be for the companies and the marketeers that are here at the Milan Marketing Festival today, how they should react to this kind of changes?
Well, that's a wonderful question because there are so many changes. And I think that the biggest one that I've seen is a very basic shift, which is that in the old days, that is 5 to 10 years ago, we had a very strict line between the producers of a product and the consumers of a product. And today, that boundary is totally obsolete, so that the consumers of the product very often are involved literally in the production of the product. And so the distinction between being a producer and a consumer in so many areas, whether it's fashion or transportation, many, many different kinds of products and services, the biggest change that I've seen is that many everyday consumers now literally are also the producers of the things that they buy.
And again, Professor, what's the main impact of this on companies, brands, and marketing professionals?
Well, a lot of marketers haven't really accepted the fact that their consumers are part of the creation process, what we sometimes call co-creators. And this is really a problem for them because they're still thinking in old-fashioned terms about, for example, not releasing a new product, until it is absolutely perfect. And in today's world, that is exactly the opposite of the way many new products, successful new products, get launched. Because, for example, when you talk about social media, when you talk about new information products, when you talk about software, we can say that products are constantly in a state of beta testing. That means there's a continuous improvement process going on, which often is facilitated by feedback from customers. So when you let customers into the process, when you bring them in much earlier, as opposed to just putting something out in the market and letting consumers vote with their dollars or with their euros, that is a very outmoded way of doing things. So in order for companies to succeed today, they have to open their doors a bit. It's very hard for them to accept this, but they have to open their doors and welcome their customers as part of the ongoing development process.
Well, Professor Solomon, in my understanding, this has all to do with the technology disrupting behavior patterns of consumers, but how can companies use technology to connect with consumers and understand better their needs?
Well, so much of co-creation is going on even as we're speaking here. Many, probably millions of consumers in Italy and around the world right now are posting ideas or reactions to new products. They're tagging, they're pinning products on Pinterest, they're texting, they're posting on Facebook. This is an invaluable source of marketing research. So it's not just important. Most companies think about social media in terms of promotion, making sure that consumers are aware of their brand, and that's important. But they can also use that technology to involve consumers to a much greater degree in the process. For example, by posting ideas for new designs and having their customers vote on them prior to production.
Now, Professor Solomon, the worst headache for marketers is to understand what influences us the most when we go out on the market and we decide to buy stuff or services. Is it more, in your view, about having or being? Is there anything new, or the same old forces in the end are out there and influence us?
No, I think, well, for one thing, as you said, the subtitle of my book is Buying, Having, and Being. And today the focus, especially for young people, but for many of us, today the focus is much more on being. That is, it's not that products are any less important, because they're very important to people. But the question is, how does that product play a role in my daily life? How does it enhance an experience that I'm going to have? And so that notion of that we sometimes call experiential marketing is extremely important. The old focus on a product as a status symbol, something that you would put in your living room so that other people can look at it and be jealous, that's not totally gone. But to a large extent, the status today comes from experiences and, again, incorporating products into the fundamental aspects of our daily lives, such as the many rituals that we perform during a day. So we see products as the means to an end, and in the old days, I think they were more of an end themselves.
Well, let me ask you, Professor, because we've been talking a lot about the data revolution today with Professor Rasetti. You talk more about psychology and behavior of consumers. Will company needs in the future more psychologists or more data scientists? What do you think? How should they hire people?
I think they need both. I mean, they certainly need the data scientists. We hear today the big fashion, if you will, is big data. Big data is very fashionable to talk about, and it's very, very important. But it by itself is not going to solve all of our problems, because big data, to a large degree, it tells us what people are going to do, and it can even predict to a large extent what people are going to buy. But it doesn't tell us why they buy. And so I think you need both pieces. You need the big data, huge amounts of information where data scientists can look for very interesting and even predictive patterns of consumption. But you also need the insights people, the ones to get in and now understand and actually go out and talk to customers. Don't just use the information that they post, in terms of their credit card transactions and what they're saying on social media. Go out and actually talk to them, and most importantly, observe the products in use. Don't do it in the laboratory. When possible, actually go to the place that the product is consumed, because very often there's a lot of nuance in terms of the context in which a product is consumed. And so, you have to fish where the fish are, as we say here in the States. And therefore, you're going to need one piece and the other piece. So it's not a question of do we hire data scientists or do we hire psychologists. I think that it's important for them to work together, and they each carry a lot of important tools into the equation.
Well, Professor, if you want to fish for fishes, you have to go where they are, and they remain in the physical space, in retail stores, in physical shops and networks of physical touch points. And how do you feel about how retail spaces will change, and marketing can do a lot about that, given that technology allows us to use shops as labs to understand consumers' behavior currently?
Yes. Well, a lot of people like to predict that retail stores, physical stores, will be obsolete in a few years, and I don't believe that. I think that the notion of what a store is will have to change, because it used to be that a store was a place where you went to acquire objects, put them in your cart, and take them home. And as you know, we can do that so many other ways without ever leaving the house, just by typing a few clicks on our computer or picking up the phone. Therefore, what the retail space has to be is it has to add value to the equation. And it can do that because there are still experiences that technology by itself can't provide. And that's why we have to think about a retail space as what I like to call a being space. That is, It's a place where people want to congregate. It's a place where they're going to learn something, where they're going to be stimulated, they're going to be entertained. And we're not quite at the point where technology is going to provide all of that. But that doesn't mean that technology has no place in these being spaces. It very much does. And I'm often surprised that many retailers are reluctant to incorporate a lot of technology into their physical stores. And I don't just mean the kind of technology that, for example, counts how many shoppers are in the store. I'm talking about interactive technologies that allow the shopper to, if you will, play with the products and to explore their possibilities. So, for example, I'm very excited about the growth of augmented reality applications. Many people are now more aware of this after the big Pokemon Go sensation last summer. But there are so many possibilities in terms of retailing and fashion design and so on that allow us to take that physical experience and now extend it to levels that we could only imagine a few years ago.
Professor, just one question about fashion, because you're a big expert in fashion marketing as well, and here in Milan we have some of the most beautiful flagship stores, but how can fashion marketers try to sync with what customers' needs are currently? Do you have any examples of someone who's getting it right and someone who's doing it wrong?
Well, again, there's technology solutions such as I've mentioned, augmented reality. So, for example, virtual dressing rooms like Topshop is doing, Uniqlo is doing, Bloomingdale's here in the States is experimenting this, where people are able to, the shopper, for example, is able to stand in front of a mirror and without actually changing her clothes, she can see what new garments are going to look like. She can experiment and look at accessories and so on. So the technology area is one solution. But another that's probably more important goes back to what I said at the beginning, which is that consumers so much today are also involved in the production process. And when you look at who the gatekeepers of fashion are today, it's so different than it used to be. In the old model, it's very much an aristocratic top-down model where the big fashion houses in Milan and places like that, the designers are going to dictate to the consumer what they're going to wear, and the shopper is going to run out and, without question, if she can afford it, she's going to buy whatever that designer dictates. Today we see, for example, a very important intermediary in that process, and that is the fashion blogger. And I know that there are many fashion bloggers in Italy, for example, who are extremely influential. So they're like curators in a museum, and they're going to take all of the dictates that these designers in Milan and Rome and Paris and so on are coming up with, and they're going to filter that and interpret that for their following. And so many of these bloggers, as you probably know, have themselves gone on to become famous. But even the ones that aren't famous are exerting a tremendous filtering capacity that is changing the way fashion moves from the big design houses to the mass market. And so the big fashion companies in Italy and elsewhere, if they're not aware of it already, have to grasp the enormous power that many of them are young women, of course, some of them are teenagers, the enormous power that they have in determining what is fashionable at any point in time.
Professor, we have to sum up, but I want to ask you a crucial question everyone is working on, which is how can brands connect with new generation of consumers, from Generation Z to millennials? And happily, we have hundreds here in the room today. And you wrote recently that US millennials spend $600 billion per year, but their choices changes faster than Lady Gaga changes her outfits. How can brands try to connect with these kind of consumers?
Yes, this is a huge challenge that has many marketers awake at night. How do we cope with the new attitudes? And of course, there's some evidence. We're just starting to learn about Generation Z, which is the younger brothers and sisters of the millennials. But we know that for example, they value companies that do good things for their communities. So one thing to do is almost obvious, but many companies don't do it, and that is to demonstrate how they are involved and how they give back to the community. Another is that they don't want mass-produced garments. They want customization. They want personalization, and they often want to know the lineage or the history of the food that they're eating, the clothing that they're wearing, and so on. So some of the companies that have been successful in talking to millennials have really shared with them the history that they have, if they're fortunate enough to have a long history. And of course, many companies in Italy do have a very long history. What they can do is open their doors and bring the consumer, share with them that lineage and that sense of authenticity, because that's probably the biggest attribute that the millennial is looking for, is authenticity. And there's many ways to define that. But if you are not providing that or communicating a sense of authenticity, you are not going to sell to millennials. So to get back to what I said earlier, involving them in the process, allowing them, they love brands. It's not that they don't like famous brands, but they want to involve those brands and basically create a collage that defines them as a unique individual, as opposed to someone who's part of a very large movement.
Well, Professor Solomon, right before we leave, I know you have a practical advice to marketeers, to students, but also to business owners and managers here in terms of how to get the best out of their marketing budget, and also how to avoid the worst mistake that in your experience companies and brands can do managing their marketing strategies. What can you tell us, wrapping it up?
Well, I think the mistake is assuming that you have an intuitive sense of your customer. Very often we find, and I've found in my own experience, that brand managers have an image of their customer that is remarkably similar to themselves. And so they assume that whatever appeals to them will appeal to their customer. And the data often indicate otherwise. So don't take for granted that you can anticipate your customers' needs and desires. You need to get out there and actually talk to them. And so I guess I would sum up my advice, to do it very briefly. I would say that the mantra today should be not marketing to your customer, but marketing with your customer and involving that customer as a team member. That heightens involvement with the brand, which is one of the biggest challenges that marketers face today, is how do we engage customers who are so distracted, who have so many options available to them in the marketplace? How do we break through that attention gap? And the way to do it is to bring them into the franchise and to make them feel that they are a part of the story. So they're not just hearing the story, they are a part of the story. That would be my basic advice.
That's a fantastic point. Well, Professor Michael Solomon, thanks again for your time this morning. It was great having you. Thanks for this terrific conversation, and I hope to see you soon in Milan.